the elections. There was a kind of independent women's movement. And just those themes of women participating, which historically, whether in the US, like civil rights movement, around the world, I think women have historically often played this role, this very important role in social movements, but also have often had to kind of fight for their rights within that. So it's kind of, those social movements open up space for women, they kind of create space for women to play new roles of leadership, have new opportunities. Women care about the kind of, the general principles of that movement, and yet there's also this kind of tension where they're not that social movement is not necessarily fighting also for women's rights. So when I got to Chiapas and I saw, on the one hand, this very vibrant revolutionary social movement, and on the other hand, women's participation within it as this very vibrant but evolving thing, I felt like that history was kind of unfolding itself in a way that I really just wanted to be there and support it and kind of be part of. So it was kind of a funny process. I mean, the Zapatistas at that time, on the one hand, were still, they're still a clandestine organization, but they were also very open to people coming and kind of carrying out projects. So you kind of had to just go to the communities and hang out for a while and kind of get to know them and let them get to know you. And then once you sort of knew someone who knew someone who knew someone, we started talking to people and saying, we'd like to support women's cooperatives in some way. We see them as this kind of important economic building block for helping these families and villages get out of poverty. But they also were very much a space, because they were gender specific, for women to kind of come to voice and come to power. And they said, that's great. Can you teach math and accounting classes? And we were like, sure, like not what I had in mind necessarily as my kind of revolutionary participation, but it made a lot of sense. Like, a lot of women hadn't been to school as girls, and they either didn't have the skills to kind of run the cooperative themselves, or they would ask a man to do it for them, which then somewhat defeated the purpose of it being this kind of empowering space for women. So that was how we started, and got to know a lot of the women. A lot of the women who were featured in my book also are people who I was really close to and felt a very deep sense of kind of solidarity, but then almost like family with. We would plan women's gatherings together, we would walk from village to village together, and so coming from a very different context, but I felt sort of very deeply connected to those communities. And I saw my role there as one of kind of support and solidarity. I mean, the Zapatista movement is very well organized and disciplined, so they don't need outsiders in that sense, but outsiders a lot of times brought in kind of resources and technical assistance that could be helpful. So I wanted to actually read a few short things from my book, which I think kind of illustrate some of the types of gender transformations that were happening, and I just kind of prefer to do it more in their words than in mine.
How long ago did you write this book?
I'm sorry?
How long ago did you write it?
So it actually just came out, but it was in the process for a long time. So I left in 2003, and as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, it was actually, I had worked on a sort of documentation process with the women, where a lot of the same themes of how women have organized, how their lives have changed, they wanted to capture for themselves. And then once we were finished that project, that was one of the last things I worked on before I left. They said, oh, would you be interested in doing something like this for an outside audience? And I was really thrilled that they proposed it, because I probably wouldn't on my own have said, oh, I want to take these stories and share them, even though I would have loved to. But because the Zapatistas are also very kind of cautious about how information gets shared about their movement, a lot of the reason that a lot of people have heard mostly of Subcomandante Marcos is because he was kind of the chosen spokesperson. And so, they're very careful about like what kind of gets officially said about the movement. So I would not have said, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and write this book. But once they were the ones who suggested it, that kind of started the process. So seeds came out of, more than 10 years ago, and then it evolved over the years. I went back and did additional interviews, and then it took a while to write, and long story short, 10 years later, here's the book.
Is there any danger in your mentioning names there that the Mexican government might identify those people as separatists? And
So most of the names are either changed, either it's they choose a name for themselves, which they call the nombre de lucha, which is like a pseudonym. So if they wanted to use that name, I used that name, or then I just changed the name myself later for exactly for that reason. So I think, I'm not sure if we mentioned this earlier, but folks know that in the uprising in 1994 came after 10 years of organizing clandestinely in the sort of mountains and the jungles of Chiapas. So during those 10 years, from 1983 to 1994, many kind of young women and men joined the EZLN, either the rebel army or they joined as civilians, and began to organize and recruit other people. So one of the young women who joined the rebel army at that time, her name is Isabel. This is actually her. So Isabel was one of the first women to join the EZLN. In 1984, when she was 14 years old, she left home to join the rebel army. During the uprising 10 years later, Isabel led a battalion of troops as a captain. She stayed in the Zapatista army for another 10 years after that and stepped down in 2003, having spent almost 2 decades of her life as a Zapatista soldier and military leader. When I first met Isabel, she was still a military commander and quite an intimidating figure. Exuding a tremendous air of authority, she did not smile often or talk much. She was fairer-skinned than most Zapatista women, and she wore her straight black hair shoulder length and loose. When I interviewed Isabel in 2008, she still wore pants and boots, and she still carried herself with that same air of authority, but she smiled more readily and spoke more openly. I was about 8 or 9 years old, she said, when I really began to think about my surroundings. I was already doing all a mother's work within my family. I began doing that work when I was very young, because my mother is a peasant woman and she works in the fields. Since I'm the oldest daughter, well, in our villages, a lot of responsibility falls on the sole shoulders of the oldest daughter. I was looking after my younger brothers and sisters, cleaning the house, and taking care of the animals. When I was invited to join the organization, I said to myself, I want to learn more, to move forward, but there's always a but, right? You have to leave everything behind. Your family, your work, community life, everything. You were taken out of that environment, away from all that, and I was 14 years old. I wanted to better myself as a person, but it was painful. It was hard to leave all that behind. I accepted this change because I had seen the suffering of all the women around me. My mother, my sisters, my aunts, my grandmothers. I saw how unfair their lives were. So I thought to myself, why not now? At 14 years old, why not commit myself to doing something for this organization called the EZLN? So that's, just one perspective of one of the people, how she kind of decided to join. Like I mentioned, the uprising happened in 1994. After that, the Zapatistas were known for all these other kind of elements of themselves as a social movement. The years after 1994 were years of a fair amount of tension with the Mexican government. On the one hand, as I mentioned, they were negotiating a peace treaty with the Mexican government, which was called the San Andres Accords, on indigenous rights and culture. And it was signed in 1996, but never implemented. But even as they were negotiating this peace treaty, there was also a lot of kind of military tension. The Mexican government really wanted to kind of undermine or destroy the Zapatista movement. So there were periodically sort of military assaults on Zapatista territory. And in 1997, 1998, there's kind of a heightened period of those types of attacks. So there were military attacks, paramilitary groups also attacking the villages. Sometimes people were displaced, whole villages were displaced, houses were burned down, people were arrested, sometimes tortured, sometimes killed. And it was often, when the Mexican military came in, it was often men that they would focus on. So women made this kind of collective decision to be the ones on the front lines. And this next selection is kind of about that process, how women decided to organize. So this is what I'm about to read. This is kind of what was, this was the scene that I'm about to read about.
How did you get that picture?
A friend of mine was there. So,
Okay.
in the face of this violence, women organized to confront the Mexican armed forces. Forming a barrier with their bodies, lines of women blocked soldiers from entering their communities, sometimes physically pushing them back, and sometimes armed with sticks or rocks. Insults were hurled at the soldiers, the women's voices carrying the pent-up rage of 4 years of low-intensity conflict. Tiny indigenous women successfully drove heavily armed soldiers out of refugee camps, remote villages, and Zapatista strongholds. Faced with the women's fury and determination, the soldiers did not know how to respond. Many times, confused and startled, they turned on their heels and fled. A small community high in the mountains, Galeana was likely singled out because it's a known Zapatista stronghold. To get there, you have to navigate a steep rocky walk into the mist, and it's hard to believe there's a village up there until you get to the peak, the last resting spot, and peer down into Galeana with its bright yellow adobe houses nestled in the mountains. Visitors were rare, and children came running out of their houses to crowd around my colleague and me. Everyone was eager to tell us how they chased the army out. They knew the soldiers were coming up the mountain path, they told us. They were angry at the carelessness with which the soldiers trampled their cornfields and ate their sugarcane. Nos cuesta mucho sudor. It was hard work, they said. When the signal was given, they all rushed down the mountain to chase the soldiers away. They described in detail how big their sticks were and what they yelled. Fuera, ejército, no queremos despensas. Get out, army. We don't want your handouts. I asked if they had been scared. I would have been. Of course not, said one young girl, but the boys tattled on her and said that she had started to cry. One of the women's favorite stories was about a soldier lying and saying he had been bitten by a snake, when in reality another soldier had shot him in the foot, by accident. Several soldiers were hiding, they said, too frightened to come out. Another memorable story was about a panicked soldier who couldn't untangle his radio line from the bushes, and he had to ask one of the Zapatista women to cut the cord so he could leave the radio behind. We chased them all the way down to the road, the women said proudly. It was perhaps a small victory in the ongoing battle between the EZLN and the Mexican government. But for the villagers in Galeana, it felt like a real success in the face of Mexican military might. News traveled quickly throughout the region, and other women referred to it as an example. Doña Manuela, the Tzeltal elder from La Garucha, talked about the women from Galeana chasing out the soldiers, and her eyes sparkled as she spoke. Known for her sharp tongue, it's not always clear whether Doña Manuela's eyes are lit up with laughter or anger. Those first days of January, we were ready, she said. We even had our sticks ready. We were all prepared, just like the women from Galeana. She stood up to demonstrate, and the stick was almost as tall as her small body, with a sharp point carved on one end. She shook the stick, as if at a soldier. But they haven't come here, she concluded. I think they were afraid. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of one of the examples of the many different ways that women kind of participated in the movement and really were kind of key actors in the movement in general, but also really kind of coming to power as women. And so I think there was a really important, Francisco and I were just talking about this before, but there was, just before the talk, I think there was this kind of concentrated time period kind of around the uprising, the years just before and after the uprising, when there was a kind of an openness, a sense of transformation in general, and gender roles were one of the things that were really being transformed at this very accelerated pace. And I think there was an important kind of coming together of, on the one hand, the EZLN as an organization had been very clear that women's rights were kind of a commitment of the movement. And a lot of those early kind of recruiters and the early organizers would come in and talk to women and say, you know, you have rights, women have rights, you have the right to participate in this movement. And that really opened up space for women. And on the other hand, there was this kind of groundswell of response from the women themselves saying, yes, you know, we want to participate in this fight for justice. We also want to see a change for ourselves as women. And the kind of combination of those things, I think, was one of the things that really kind of helped these years where things were just changing so quickly, and like we talked about, the kind of level of discrimination that women were facing, and 10 years later, there had been this kind of extraordinary level of transformation where women were participating in leadership, in political roles, but there had been all these changes in terms of choosing who they were going to marry, deciding how many kids to have. Domestic violence dropped very dramatically, and I think that was partly because there was, a shift around domestic violence not being acceptable and women standing up for themselves. But there also was a law passed, an internal Zapatista law passed banning alcohol. So that was actually a very interesting step that the EZLN took, and women were really key in getting that passed. Like the EZLN leadership wanted it because they actually wanted to protect the organization's security. This was still when the organization was clandestine. So before 1994, they were basically afraid, someone would get drunk and spill the beans about this uprising that was planned. But women really saw it as a question of public health, of community well-being, of the well-being of their families and their kids, and their relationship with domestic violence. So they really pushed for this proposal, and this agreement was reached by talking and discussing it in each village to ban alcohol. And that's just, that's also an example of women kind of early on exercising their kind of collective power and within the movement, but also sort of around women's rights in particular. The Women's Revolutionary Law was also passed kind of just before 1994, and that includes sort of some basic rights, women's rights, that became kind of like a guideline for women's rights in Zapatista territory. But then you do get these kind of amazing women leaders who are the kind of some of the well-known figures. Ana Maria was the military leader who led the occupation in San Cristobal. Comandante Ramona helped negotiate the peace treaty with the EZLN and the Mexican government. Comandante Esther, I mentioned, she was the first indigenous woman who ever spoke before Mexican Congress in 2001, which is kind of insane because it means no indigenous woman had ever spoken before Mexican Congress until then. But, so these women who have come from like what Isabel was describing, but really sort of took on these roles of leadership in the movement. So that process of gender transformation, the last thing I wanted to read is from a woman named Selena. That's Selena. And so she's kind of talking about some of the transformations that took place related to land. We were talking about the land takeovers, but also kind of in her own family. Like many Zapatista women, Selena spent her childhood on a finca, but now lives in an all-Zapatista village and farms on reclaimed land. One morning, I accompanied her to her family's plot of land. We walked for more than an hour before arriving at her cornfield, climbing hills, crossing a hammock bridge, and passing through other fields on narrow dirt paths. As we walked, she recalled the hardships of her young life. My father worked very hard on that finca, she said, and sometimes they paid him, and sometimes they didn't. We didn't have corn, we didn't have beans, we didn't have coffee to drink because we didn't have anywhere to plant coffee. We did whatever we could to survive. We sold firewood, we sold charcoal, but I didn't think about all this until I was older. When I was younger, I thought that's just how things were. The EZLN arrived and told us that the government was oppressing us. They talked to us about land. So we started organizing, men and women. Despite having no formal education, Selena has held a number of different positions within the Zapatista movement, utilizing her natural ability to listen to others and to motivate them to act. They had schools in some of the villages, but not on the fincas, she said. That's why everyone who grew up on a finca, none of us know how to read or write. Recognizing her own leadership qualities, she often said ruefully that being illiterate was the only thing holding her back. After several hours of hoeing weeds in her cornfield, we took refuge from the midday sun in the shade of a tree. Selena took a ball of ground corn out of her bag, and as she mixed it with water to make pozol, she described one of the biggest transformations in her own life. The change